The dust from the stagecoach wheels hadn't even settled when Harper Daniels noticed the tall cowboy dismounting his chestnut mare outside her brother's post office. A leather satchel slung across his broad shoulders that looked heavier than any mail delivery she had ever seen. She stood on the wooden sidewalk of Montrose, Colorado, shielding her eyes from the late afternoon sun of August 1883, watching him move with the careful deliberation of a man who understood the weight of responsibility. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, darkened by several days' worth of stubble, and the way his weathered hands gripped that satchel as though it contained something far more precious than ordinary letters. Harper had been living with her brother Thomas for nearly 6 months now, ever since their parents had passed from fever back in Kansas City. Thomas had established himself as postmaster of Montrose 3 years prior, and when Harper found herself alone at 22 years old with no prospects and no family left except him, he had written her a letter that simply said, "Come west." So she had packed her few belongings, boarded a train, then a stagecoach, and arrived in this small Colorado town nestled in the Uncompahgre Valley with the San Juan Mountains rising like sentinels in the distance. The work had been good for her. She helped Thomas sort mail, kept the ledgers, and minded the counter when he made his rounds to the surrounding ranches. The people of Montrose were kind enough, if a bit rough around the edges, and Harper had grown accustomed to the way cowboys would tip their hats to her, the way miners would track dust across the freshly swept floor, the way ranch wives would linger to share gossip while collecting their correspondence from distant relatives. But this cowboy was different. Harper sensed it immediately. He pushed open the door and the bell above it chimed. Thomas looked up from the sorting table, his spectacles perched on his nose. "Afternoon. How can I help you?" The cowboy removed his hat, revealing dark hair that fell just past his collar, slightly damp with sweat. His eyes were a startling shade of blue-green, like the river on a clear day, and when they landed on Harper, she felt something shift in her chest, as though her heart had momentarily forgotten its rhythm. "Name is Zachary Dalton," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel under wagon wheels. "I have been riding circuit for the Postal Service, covering the route from Ouray to here. Got caught in that rockslide 2 days back near Red Mountain Pass. The regular mail carrier, Bill Henderson, he did not make it." Thomas straightened immediately, his face going pale. "Bill is dead." Zachary nodded slowly, and Harper saw the grief in his eyes, raw and recent. "I was riding behind him by about a quarter mile, heard the rumble, got there as fast as I could, but the rocks had already come down. I dug for 3 hours, but by the time I reached him, he was gone. I buried him proper, marked the spot. Figured the most important thing was to get this mail through. Bill was particular about his duty." Harper moved closer to the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden surface. "You knew him." "We rode together for the Pony Express back in '61, before the telegraph put us out of work. Lost touch for a while, then crossed paths again when I started working cattle drives. Bill mentioned he had steady work with the Postal Service now, thought I might be interested. I was supposed to meet him in Ouray, ride the circuit with him for a few weeks to learn the route." Zachary's jaw tightened. "Arrived a day early, decided to follow at a distance, see how he managed the terrain." Thomas came around the counter and placed a hand on Zachary's shoulder. "You did right by bringing the mail through. Bill would have wanted that. We will need to notify the regional office, and someone will need to go back to retrieve his body properly." "I can lead them to the spot," Zachary said, "but I figured you would want to see these first." He opened the satchel and began pulling out bundles of letters, packages wrapped in brown paper, small parcels tied with twine. "Some of these are time-sensitive. There is one from the territorial governor's office and several that look like bank documents. Harper began helping to sort the mail onto the counter, and her fingers brushed against Zachary's as they both reached for the same bundle. The contact sent a jolt through her, and she pulled back quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. When she glanced up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "I am Harper," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "Thomas is my brother. I help run the post office." "Miss Daniels," Zachary said, and the way he said her name made her stomach flip. "Pleasure to meet you, though I wish the circumstances were different." For the next hour, they worked together sorting through the mail. Thomas verified each piece against the manifest that Bill had been carrying, making careful notes in his ledger. Harper found herself acutely aware of Zachary's presence. The way he moved with quiet efficiency. The way his hands handled each letter with care. The way he would pause occasionally to read an address, and then place the item in the correct pile without needing direction. "You have done this before," she observed. "Some," Zachary admitted. "Like I said, I rode for the Pony Express for a while. Before that, I worked my father's ranch up in Wyoming until he died. After that, I did not have much reason to stay. I have been drifting mostly, taking work where I can find it. Cattle drives, freight hauling, a stint as a deputy marshal in Durango that did not last long because I could not abide the sheriff's way of handling things." "What way was that?" Thomas asked, looking up from his ledger. Zachary's expression darkened. He was taking bribes from the mining companies to look the other way when their hired guns ran off homesteaders who had legal claims to land. I told him I would not be part of it. He told me I could leave or be buried. I chose leaving. Harper felt a surge of respect for this man who had walked away from steady work rather than compromise his principles. "That must have been difficult." "Not as difficult as living with myself if I had stayed," Zachary replied simply. When the mail was finally sorted, and Thomas had made arrangements for several items to be delivered to nearby ranches the following morning, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas invited Zachary to stay for supper, and Harper found herself hoping he would accept. "I do not want to impose," Zachary said. "Nonsense," Thomas replied. "You rode through a rockslide to deliver mail that was not even your responsibility. The least we can do is feed you. Besides, you will need a place to stay tonight, and the boarding house is full up with miners. We have a spare room above the post office." Zachary hesitated, his gaze moving between Thomas and Harper. "If you are sure it is no trouble." "No trouble at all," Harper said quickly, perhaps too quickly, because Thomas gave her a curious look. They climbed the narrow stairs to the living quarters above the post office, where Harper had already begun preparing a stew that had been simmering on the stove all afternoon. The space was modest but comfortable, with a small kitchen, a sitting area with worn but serviceable furniture, and 2 bedrooms at the far end of the hallway. The spare room had been used for storage until Harper's arrival, and she had spent her first week in Montrose cleaning it out and making it habitable for guests. While Harper set the table, Thomas poured 3 glasses of whiskey. "To Bill Henderson," he said, raising his glass. "He was a good man and a faithful servant of the Postal Service." "To Bill," Zachary and Harper echoed, and they drank. Over supper, the conversation flowed more easily. Thomas asked Zachary about the condition of the mountain passes, about the towns between Ouray and Montrose, about whether he had encountered any trouble with bandits or hostile Indians. Zachary answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating a keen understanding of the territory and its dangers. "The Utes who still remain in these parts have been peaceful enough," Zachary said. The Meeker incident back in '79 stirred up a lot of bad feelings, but most of the tribe was moved to reservations in Utah after that. The ones I have encountered have been more interested in trading than fighting. It is the white outlaws you have to worry about now. There is a gang operating out of the mountains south of here, led by a man named Cutler Briggs. They have been hitting stage coaches and freight wagons. I heard talk in our array that they might be planning something bigger. Thomas frowned. The bank here has been receiving large gold shipments from the mines. If word of that has spread, we could be in for trouble. You might want to talk to the sheriff about increasing patrols, Zachary suggested. Our sheriff is old and tired, Harper said. He mostly deals with drunken miners and the occasional dispute over water rights. I do not think he would know what to do with a gang of outlaws. Zachary's expression grew thoughtful. The regional postal inspector might be interested in hiring additional security for mail delivery, especially on the mountain routes. If they are willing to pay, I would be interested in the work. I know those passes pretty well now, and I do not have anywhere else I need to be. Harper felt her heart lift at the possibility that Zachary might stay in Montrose. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but when she looked up, she found Thomas watching her with a knowing smile. After supper, Harper insisted on washing the dishes while Thomas and Zachary sat in the sitting area, discussing the logistics of mail delivery and the best routes to take during the coming winter months. She could hear their voices, low and comfortable, and found herself listening for Zachary's in particular. The way it rumbled with quiet authority, the way he chose his words carefully, the way he occasionally chuckled at something Thomas said. When she finished and came to join them, Thomas was yawning. "I apologize," he said. "It has been a long day, and I am afraid I am not as young as I used to be. Harper, would you mind showing Zachary to the spare room?" "Of course," Harper said, trying to ignore the way her brother's eyes twinkled with mischief. Thomas bid them both good night and disappeared into his bedroom, leaving Harper alone with Zachary. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with something Harper could not quite name. "The spare room is this way," she said, leading him down the short hallway. She opened the door to reveal a small but tidy room with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street of Montrose. "This is perfect," Zachary said. "Thank you, Miss Daniels." "Harper," she corrected. "You can call me Harper." He smiled then, a slow smile that transformed his entire face, softening the hard edges and making him look younger, more carefree. "Harper," he repeated. "That is a pretty name." "It was my grandmother's name," she said. "She was a schoolteacher in Boston before she married my grandfather and moved west. My mother used to say I had her stubborn streak." "Stubborn can be a good quality in these parts," Zachary said. "Takes a certain amount of stubbornness just to survive out here." They stood in the doorway, neither quite willing to end the conversation. Harper found herself noticing small details about him, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of hard work. "I am glad you are safe," she said suddenly. "From the rock slide, I mean. It could have been you as well as Bill." Something flickered in Zachary's eyes, something dark and haunted. "I have thought about that. If I had been riding alongside him instead of behind him, maybe I could have warned him in time. Or maybe we both would have been caught." Harper reached out without thinking and placed her hand on his arm. "You cannot think like that. You did what you could, and you honored his memory by bringing the mail through. That matters." Zachary looked down at her hand on his arm, and Harper became suddenly aware of how forward she was being. She started to pull away, but he covered her hand with his own, holding it in place. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that." They stood like that for a long moment, and Harper felt the warmth of his hand seeping into her skin, felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, felt the world narrowing down to just the two of them in this small hallway with the oil lamp flickering on the wall. "Good night, Zachary," she whispered. "Good night, Harper," he replied, and reluctantly released her hand. Harper retreated to her own room, closing the door behind her and leaning against it, her heart pounding. She could not remember the last time she had felt this way, this strange combination of excitement and nervousness and anticipation. She changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Her mind kept returning to the way Zachary had looked at her, the way his hand had felt covering hers, the way his voice had softened when he said her name. The next morning, Harper woke early and dressed quickly, braiding her dark hair and pinning it up in a simple style. When she emerged from her room, she found Zachary already awake, standing at the window in the sitting area and looking out at the street below. He had washed and shaved, and in the morning light he looked younger than she had initially thought, probably only a few years older than her own 22. "Could not sleep?" she asked. He turned, and his expression brightened when he saw her. "I am used to being up before dawn. Old habit from ranch work. There is coffee on the stove. I hope you do not mind. I helped myself to the kitchen." "Not at all," Harper said, pleased that he had made himself at home. She poured herself a cup of coffee and joined him at the window. Below, Montrose was beginning to wake up. A freight wagon rumbled past, and across the street, the owner of the general store was sweeping his front step. "It is a nice town," Zachary observed. "Feels peaceful." "It is," Harper agreed. "Very different from Kansas City, where I grew up. I was not sure I would like it here at first, but it has grown on me." "What made you decide to come west?" Harper took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "After my parents died, I did not have many options. I could have stayed with my aunt, but she made it clear she considered me a burden. I could have tried to find work as a seamstress or a shop girl, but those positions are difficult to come by, and the pay is poor. When Thomas wrote and said he needed help with the post office, it seemed like the best choice. The only choice, really." "Do you miss the city?" "Sometimes," Harper admitted. "I miss the theaters and the libraries and the sense that there is always something happening. But I do not miss the crowds or the noise or the way everyone is always in such a hurry. Here, people take the time to talk to each other. They know their neighbors. There is a sense of community that I did not find in Kansas City." Zachary nodded. "I know what you mean. I have spent most of my life in small towns and open country. The few times I have been to places like Denver or San Francisco, I felt like I could not breathe properly. Too many buildings, too many people, too much everything." They fell into a comfortable silence, sipping their coffee and watching the town wake up. Harper found herself wishing this moment could last longer, that she could stand here beside Zachary and feel this sense of quiet contentment stretch on indefinitely. Thomas emerged from his room, already dressed and ready for the day. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "Zachary, I sent a telegram to the regional postal inspector last night before I came upstairs. I received a reply first thing this morning. They want you to stay on temporarily as a mail courier until they can find a permanent replacement for Bill. They are offering $75 a month plus expenses. Are you interested?" Zachary's eyes widened slightly. "That is generous. Yes, I am interested." "Excellent," Thomas said, rubbing his hands together. "You will need to ride back to our array today to meet with the inspector and get the official paperwork sorted out. He is traveling up from Denver and should be there by this evening." "Can you manage that?" "Of course," Zachary said. "I will leave within the hour." Harper felt a stab of disappointment. She had been hoping Zachary would stay in Montrose for at least another day, but she understood the necessity of his trip. "When will you be back?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Tomorrow evening, most likely," Zachary said. "The ride to our array is about 6 hours if the weather holds and the trails are clear. I will meet with the inspector, get whatever documents I need, and head back first thing the following morning." After a quick breakfast, Zachary gathered his belongings and prepared to leave. Harper walked him down to the street where his chestnut mare was tethered. The horse was a beautiful animal, well-muscled and alert, with intelligent eyes and a glossy coat. "She is lovely," Harper said, reaching out to stroke the mare's nose. "What is her name?" "Sage," Zachary said. "I won her in a card game up in Cheyenne 3 years ago. The previous owner was mistreating her, and I could not stand to see it. I bet everything I had just to get her away from him." Harper smiled. "You are a good man, Zachary Dalton." He looked at her intently, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "I will be back tomorrow evening," he said. "Will you be here?" "I will be here," Harper promised. Zachary swung up into the saddle with easy grace, settled his hat on his head, and gathered the reins. He looked down at Harper, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, but instead he simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell and urged Sage into a trot. Harper watched until he disappeared around the bend in the road, then returned to the post office where Thomas was already hard at work sorting the morning's mail. "You like him," Thomas said without looking up. Harper felt her cheeks flush. "I barely know him." "You like him," Thomas repeated, this time with a grin. "I can tell. You get this look in your eyes like you are seeing something the rest of us cannot." "Thomas, please," Harper said, but she could not help smiling. "I am just saying he seems like a good man," Thomas continued. "And he clearly likes you too. I saw the way he looked at you last night at supper." Harper busied herself with organizing the mail, trying to hide her pleasure at Thomas's words. "He is only going to be here temporarily. Once they find a permanent replacement for Bill, he will probably move on." "Maybe," Thomas said, "or maybe he will find a reason to stay." The day passed slowly. Harper helped customers, sorted mail, and tried not to watch the clock. By evening, she found herself standing at the window, looking out at the road as though she could will Zachary to appear, even though she knew he would not return until the following day. That night, she lay in bed thinking about him. She thought about the way he had held her hand in the hallway, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, the way he had said her name. She thought about the fact that he had risked his life to deliver mail that was not his responsibility, that he had buried a friend, and then pushed through his grief to honor that friend's commitment. She thought about the way he had won a horse in a card game just to save her from mistreatment, the way he had walked away from a job rather than compromise his principles. Harper had known many men in her life. She had been courted by 2 different suitors back in Kansas City, both of whom had lost interest when they learned that her family had no money to speak of. She had met countless men through the post office, ranchers and miners and shopkeepers and drifters. But none of them had made her feel the way Zachary did, as though something inside her was waking up after a long sleep. The next day dragged even more slowly than the one before. Harper threw herself into her work, helping Thomas with the accounts and reorganizing the storage room and scrubbing the front counter until it gleamed. Thomas watched her with poorly concealed amusement, but had the good sense not to comment. It was just past 6 in the evening when Harper heard the sound of hoofbeats outside. She rushed to the window and saw Zachary dismounting from Sage, looking travel-worn but unharmed. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a surge of joy. She forced herself to walk, not run, to the door. When she opened it, Zachary was tying Sage to the hitching post. He looked up at the sound of the door and smiled, and Harper felt that smile all the way down to her toes. "You are back," she said, stating the obvious. "I am back," he confirmed. He climbed the steps to the sidewalk and stood before her, close enough that she could smell the dust of the trail on his clothes, the faint scent of leather and horse, and something uniquely him. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well enough," Zachary said. "The inspector was satisfied with my account of what happened to Bill. They have officially hired me on as a temporary mail courier, with the possibility of making the position permanent if I want it. I am to make the circuit twice a week, our way to Montrose and back, with occasional trips to the smaller settlements in between." "That is wonderful," Harper said, and meant it. "There is more," Zachary said, and his expression turned serious. "The inspector confirmed what I heard in our way about Cutler Briggs and his gang. They have hit 3 stagecoaches in the past month, and there is reason to believe they are planning to rob the bank here in Montrose. The inspector wants me to keep my eyes open, report anything suspicious." Harper felt a chill run down her spine. "Is it dangerous?" "Everything is dangerous out here," Zachary said, "but I will be careful, I promise you that." Thomas appeared in the doorway behind Harper. "Zachary, good to see you back safe. Come on upstairs." Harper has been cooking all afternoon, and I think she made enough food to feed half the town. Harper shot her brother a look that clearly said, "I am going to kill you," but Thomas just grinned and headed back inside. Over supper, Zachary told them more about his meeting with the postal inspector, about the condition of the roads, about the people he had encountered on his journey. He had a way of telling stories that made even mundane details interesting, and Harper found herself hanging on his every word. After the meal, Thomas excused himself early again, claiming he had correspondence to write. Harper suspected he was making himself scarce deliberately, but she was grateful nonetheless. She and Zachary sat in the sitting area, and Harper served coffee. The windows were open to the evening breeze, and from somewhere down the street came the sound of a piano playing in one of the saloons. "Can I ask you something?" Harper said after a long, comfortable silence. "Anything," Zachary replied. "Why do you keep moving?" "You said you have been drifting, taking work where you can find it, but you seem like the kind of man who would want to put down roots somewhere, have a place to call home." Zachary stared into his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. "I did have a home once, the ranch in Wyoming where I grew up. My father built that place from nothing, and I always thought I would do the same, take over when he got too old to manage it himself. But then he died, and I found out he had been borrowing money to keep the operation going, more money than the ranch was worth. The bank foreclosed and I lost everything. I was 23 years old and suddenly I had nothing and nowhere to go." "I am so sorry," Harper said softly. Zachary shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. "It was 7 years ago. I have made my peace with it, mostly. But I think part of me has been afraid to settle down anywhere since then, afraid of building something only to lose it again. It is easier to keep moving, to not get too attached to any one place or any one thing." "Or any one person?" Harper asked quietly. Zachary looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability, longing, and something else she could not quite name. "Or any one person," he agreed. "But lately, I have been thinking that maybe I have been wrong about that. Maybe running from attachment is not the same thing as protecting yourself. Maybe it is just another way of losing." Harper set down her coffee cup and moved to sit beside him on the worn sofa. "I know what it is like to lose everything," she said. "When my parents died, I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. But coming here, building a life in Montrose, it has taught me that loss does not have to be the end of everything. It can be the beginning of something new." Zachary reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Harper, I need to tell you something. I know we have only known each other for 2 days, and I know this probably sounds crazy, but I cannot stop thinking about you. From the moment I walked into that post office and saw you standing there, something inside me recognized you. Like I had been looking for you my whole life without even knowing it." Harper's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "It does not sound crazy," she whispered, "because I feel the same way. I have been trying to tell myself that it is too soon, that I should be sensible and cautious. But every time I look at you, I forget all of those reasonable arguments." Zachary lifted his free hand and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I do not know what the future holds," he said. "I do not know if the Postal Service will keep me on permanently or if something will happen to force me to move on again. But I know that I want to try. I want to see where this goes if you are willing." "I am willing," Harper said, and then Zachary was kissing her and the world fell away. His lips were warm and gentle, and Harper felt herself melting into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself to this moment, to this feeling, to this man who had appeared in her life, like an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "Harper Daniels," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you delivered yourself to me." Harper laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I think you are the one who did the delivering, Cowboy." "Then I guess we delivered ourselves to each other," Zachary said, and kissed her again. They spent the next hour talking, learning about each other in the way that new lovers do, hungry for every detail, every story, every piece of history that made the other who they were. Zachary told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the time he had broken his arm trying to wrestle a calf and his father had said it himself because the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away. Harper told him about her childhood in Kansas City, about her mother's love of books, about her father's work as a clerk in a shipping office, about the way the fever had taken them both within a week of each other, leaving her alone in a world that suddenly seemed impossibly large and frightening. "But you were not alone," Zachary said. "You had Thomas." "I did," Harper agreed, "and now I have you." "Now you have me," Zachary confirmed, and the way he said it sounded like a promise. The following weeks fell into a pattern. Zachary would ride out to our Ray twice a week, delivering mail and bringing back new correspondence. He would spend the night in our Ray, sleeping in the small room the Postal Service maintained for couriers, and then return to Montrose the next day. When he was in town, he stayed in the spare room above the post office, and he and Harper spent every possible moment together. They would walk through Montrose in the evenings, strolling down the main street and out past the edge of town where the fields opened up and the mountains rose in the distance. They would sit on the front porch of the post office, watching the sun set and talking about everything and nothing. They would help Thomas sort mail, working side by side in comfortable silence broken occasionally by soft laughter or a shared glance that made Harper's stomach flutter. Thomas watched their growing relationship with approval and no small amount of satisfaction. "I knew it," he said to Harper one morning when Zachary was out delivering mail to a nearby ranch. "I knew the moment I saw the way you two looked at each other." "You are insufferable," Harper said, but she was smiling. "I am right," Thomas corrected. "He is a good man, Harper. He will treat you well." "I know," Harper said softly, "but not everything was perfect. There was still the matter of Cutler Briggs and his gang. Reports continued to come in of robberies and attacks on the roads between Montrose and our Ray. A freight wagon had been hit just outside of Ridgway, and the driver had been badly beaten. A prospector traveling alone had been found dead on the trail, his horse and supplies stolen. The tension in Montrose was palpable, and the sheriff, old and overmatched as he was, seemed unable to do anything about it. Zachary took to riding with extra caution, his rifle always within easy reach, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain for signs of trouble. Harper worried every time he left, and she could not fully relax until she saw him riding back into town, safe and unharmed. It was early October when things came to a head. Zachary had left for our Ray on a Tuesday morning, promising to be back by Wednesday evening. But Wednesday came and went with no sign of him. Thursday morning arrived and still nothing. By Thursday afternoon, Harper was frantic. "Something has happened to him," she said to Thomas, pacing back and forth across the post office. "He would have sent word if he was delayed. He would not just disappear." Thomas tried to calm her, but she could see the worry in his own eyes. "I will talk to the sheriff," he said. "We will organize a search party." But before Thomas could leave, the door to the post office burst open and Zachary stumbled inside. His shirt was torn and bloody, his face bruised, and he was favoring his left leg. Harper rushed to him and he collapsed into her arms. "Zachary, what happened?" she cried, helping him to a chair. "Briggs," Zachary managed to say through gritted teeth. "His gang ambushed me on Red Mountain Pass. They wanted the mail, thought there might be money or valuables. I fought them off, but they got the mail pouch before I could stop them." Thomas quickly locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, then helped Harper get Zachary upstairs. They laid him on the sofa and Harper began carefully removing his shirt to examine his injuries. There was a deep gash along his ribs that was still bleeding sluggishly, and his torso was covered in bruises. His left leg had been grazed by a bullet, leaving a bloody furrow along his thigh. "We need to get the doctor," Harper said, but Zachary grabbed her wrist. "No doctor," he said. "Briggs said they are planning to hit the bank tomorrow morning. They think the gold shipment from the mines is being stored there. If we bring in the doctor, if anyone sees me like this, it might tip them off that I got away. They think they killed me. They pushed me off the trail into a ravine. It took me a whole day to climb back out." Thomas swore under his breath. "We need to warn the sheriff." "We need to be smart about this," Zachary said. "Briggs has 6 men with him, maybe more. The sheriff does not have the manpower to face them head-on, but if we know when they are coming, we can set a trap." Harper was already gathering supplies to clean his wounds. "You are in no condition to fight anyone," she said firmly. "I will heal," Zachary said, then winced as Harper began cleaning the gash on his ribs with whiskey. Over the next few hours, they formulated a plan. Thomas would quietly alert the sheriff and a few trusted men in town, ranchers and former soldiers who knew how to handle themselves in a fight. They would position themselves around the bank before dawn, hidden and waiting. When Briggs and his gang arrived, they would be ready. Harper hated the plan. She hated that Zachary would be in danger again, hated that the men she had come to know in Montrose would be risking their lives. But she understood the necessity of it. If they did not stop Briggs now, the robberies and murders would continue. That night, she sat beside Zachary on the sofa, his head resting in her lap while she gently stroked his hair. He had been given laudanum for the pain, and his eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady. "Harper," he murmured. "I am here," she said softly. "If something happens tomorrow, if I do not make it, I need you to know something." "Hush," Harper said, her eyes filling with tears. "Nothing is going to happen to you. Please just listen," Zachary said, opening his eyes to look up at her. "I need you to know that these past few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You made me remember what it is like to have something worth fighting for, something worth staying for. I love you, Harper Daniels." I have loved you since the moment you put your hand on my arm and told me that I could not blame myself for Bill's death. I have loved you every moment since." Harper was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too," she whispered, "and you are going to be fine. We are going to get through this, and then we are going to have a life together. Do you hear me? A real life, not just stolen moments and constant goodbyes." Zachary reached up and wiped away her tears with his thumb. "Then I will fight like hell to make sure that happens," he said. Harper leaned down and kissed him, tasting salt and whiskey and the promise of a future that suddenly felt desperately fragile. The next morning arrived cold and clear. Harper woke before dawn and found that Zachary was already up, moving carefully as he dressed and checked his weapons. The wounds were still painful, she could see that in the way he moved, but the bleeding had stopped and his eyes were clear. "You should stay here," Harper said from the doorway of her room. Zachary turned to her and shook his head. "This is my fight. Briggs tried to kill me and he stole mail that I was responsible for. I have to see this through." Harper crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, careful not to press against his injuries. "Then you come back to me," she said fiercely. "You hear me, Zachary Dalton? You come back." "I will," he promised, and kissed her long and deep, as though he was trying to memorize the taste of her, the feel of her in his arms. Thomas appeared, already dressed and armed with a shotgun. "The men are in position," he said quietly. "The sheriff is coordinating from inside the bank. We should go." Zachary reluctantly released Harper and followed Thomas downstairs and out into the pre-dawn darkness. Harper watched them go, then returned to the window, unable to do anything but wait. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Montrose seemed eerily quiet, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Harper stood at the window, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. It was just past 7 when she heard the sound of galloping horses. 6 riders came thundering down the main street, led by a tall man with a scarred face that Harper instinctively knew must be Cutler Briggs. They pulled up in front of the bank, and Briggs and 3 of his men dismounted while the other 2 stayed with the horses. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Briggs kicked open the door to the bank and disappeared inside with his men. Harper heard shouting, then the crack of gunfire. More shots followed, rapid and overlapping, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. The 2 men holding the horses suddenly jerked and fell, and Harper realized that unseen shooters had taken them down. The horses, spooked by the gunfire, bolted down the street. More shots came from inside the bank, and then Briggs and his remaining men came running out, firing wildly. The street erupted in chaos. Men appeared from their hiding places, firing from doorways and rooftops and from behind water troughs. Briggs and his gang tried to return fire, but they were outnumbered and outflanked. One by one, the outlaws fell. Briggs himself was the last man standing. He fired 2 more shots, then turned and ran toward the alley beside the bank. Harper saw Zachary emerge from behind a wagon and give chase, and her breath caught in her throat. The next few minutes were the longest of Harper's life. She could not see what was happening in the alley, could only hear the sounds of a scuffle, the thud of fists on flesh, a single gunshot that made her cry out. Then silence. Harper was moving before she even realized it, running down the stairs and out into the street. People were emerging from buildings, clustering around the fallen outlaws, talking in excited, frightened voices. Harper pushed through them, making her way to the alley. She found Zachary standing over Briggs's prone body, breathing hard, his shirt spotted with fresh blood. Briggs was still alive but badly wounded, clutching his shoulder and cursing. The sheriff and 2 deputies were hurrying over to take him into custody. "Zachary," Harper breathed, and he turned to her. She could see the pain in his face, the exhaustion, but he was standing, he was alive, and that was all that mattered. She ran to him and threw her arms around him, not caring that there were people watching, not caring about anything except the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I told you I would come back," Zachary said, his voice rough but laced with something that might have been relief or triumph or simple joy. "You did," Harper said, holding him tighter. "You came back." The aftermath of the fight was chaotic. Briggs and the 2 surviving members of his gang were taken into custody. The outlaws who had been killed were laid out in front of the undertaker's office. The sheriff made arrangements to wire the territorial marshal's office and request assistance in transporting the prisoners to the federal courthouse in Denver. The stolen mail was recovered from Briggs's saddlebags, along with a considerable amount of money and valuables taken from previous robberies. The postal inspector, when he arrived 2 days later, commended Zachary for his bravery and offered to make his position as mail courier permanent. Zachary accepted, but with a condition. "I want to stay in Montrose," he said. "I do not want to ride circuit anymore. If you need someone to manage the local deliveries, to coordinate with the other couriers, I will do that, but I am done with the long mountain runs." The inspector agreed, and just like that, Zachary had a steady job and a reason to put down roots. Harper's wounds took time to heal, both physical and emotional. The gash on his ribs required stitches, and the bullet graze on his leg left a scar that would last the rest of his life. But more than that, the fight with Briggs had forced him to confront the fact that he had been running for most of his adult life, and that running had nearly cost him everything that mattered. "I am done running," he told Harper one evening as they sat on the porch of the post office, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "I want to build something here. A life, a home, a future, with you if you will have me." Harper turned to him, her eyes shining. "You delivered yourself to me," she said, echoing the words he had spoken weeks earlier. "And I am never letting you go." 3 weeks later, on a crisp November morning, Zachary Dalton and Harper Daniels were married in the small church at the edge of Montrose. Thomas walked Harper down the aisle, beaming with pride. The townspeople filled the pews, ranchers and miners and shopkeepers, who had come to witness the union of the postmaster's sister and the cowboy who had saved their town. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Harper wore a dress of pale blue silk that she had sewn herself, and Zachary wore his best shirt and a string tie that Thomas had lent him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed Harper with such tenderness that more than one woman in the congregation wiped away tears. After the wedding, there was a celebration at the largest saloon in town, which the owner had generously donated for the occasion. There was food and drink and dancing, and Harper found herself whirled from one partner to another as the townspeople took turns congratulating her and Zachary. But the best moment came late in the evening when the crowd had thinned and the musicians were packing up their instruments. Zachary took Harper's hand and led her outside, away from the noise and laughter, to a quiet spot beneath a cottonwood tree. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small cloth bag and handed it to her. Harper opened it carefully and gasped. Inside was a delicate gold locket, intricately engraved with a pattern of leaves and flowers. She opened it and found a tiny photograph of the two of them, taken by the traveling photographer who had passed through Montrose the week before. "Zachary, it is beautiful," she breathed. "I wanted you to have something to remember this day," Zachary said. "But more than that, I wanted you to know that you are my home now. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." Harper threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, pouring all of her love and gratitude and joy into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and laughing, Zachary swung her up into his arms and carried her back toward the post office, where Thomas had discreetly prepared the upstairs living quarters for their wedding night. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and discovery. Zachary took over the management of local mail deliveries, hiring 2 young men to help with the routes to the outlying ranches and settlements. Harper continued to work in the post office, and she and Thomas formed an efficient team, managing the daily operations and handling correspondence with the regional postal service. In the spring, Zachary used his savings to purchase a small piece of land just outside of town, 5 acres with a creek running through it and a view of the mountains. "I want to build us a house," he told Harper. "Nothing fancy, but something that is ours." Harper was thrilled. Together, they spent their evenings drawing up plans, deciding where the house would sit, how many rooms it would have, whether to include a front porch or a back porch or both. Zachary hired a local carpenter to help with the construction, and by midsummer, the frame of the house was going up. Harper would ride out on Sundays, bringing lunch for Zachary and the carpenter, and she would sit on a blanket in the shade and watch the house take shape. She could see their future in those walls, could imagine children running through the rooms, could picture herself and Zachary growing old together in this place they were building. By autumn, the house was finished. It was a simple structure, 2 bedrooms and a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a wide front porch that faced the mountains. Zachary carried Harper over the threshold, and they spent their first night in their new home lying in front of the fireplace, wrapped in blankets and talking about all the things they would do, all the memories they would make. "I want to fill this house with love," Harper said softly. "It is already full of love," Zachary replied, kissing her forehead. "You brought it with you." The following spring, Harper discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had seen women die in childbirth, had heard the stories of difficult labors and babies who did not survive. But when she told Zachary, his face lit up with such unalloyed happiness that her fears receded, replaced by excitement and anticipation. Thomas was equally thrilled, already making plans to spoil his future niece or nephew. "You are going to be wonderful parents," he said, and Harper believed him. The pregnancy was not easy. Harper suffered from nausea in the early months, and as she grew larger, she found it increasingly difficult to help at the post office. Zachary was endlessly patient and solicitous, insisting that she rest, bringing her water and food, rubbing her aching back and swollen feet. In November, 2 years after their wedding, Harper went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth that lasted through the night and into the following day. The midwife stayed by her side, coaching her through the contractions, and Zachary held her hand and whispered encouragement, his face pale with worry finally. As the sun was setting on the second day, Harper gave one final push and their son was born. He was small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue-green eyes. The midwife cleaned him and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in Harper's arms. Harper looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Zachary leaned over, his eyes filled with tears, and gently touched his son's cheek. "He is perfect," he said, his voice breaking. "What should we name him?" Harper asked. Zachary thought for a moment. "William," he said quietly. "After Bill Henderson, the man who brought me to you." Harper smiled. "William Dalton, it is a good name." William was a happy baby, quick to smile and rarely fussy. Zachary proved to be a devoted father, often rising in the night to walk with William when he could not sleep, singing him soft songs that he remembered from his own childhood. Harper would watch from the bed, her heart full to bursting with love for both of them. The years that followed were full and rich. Harper and Zachary welcomed 2 more children, a daughter they named Rose when William was 3, and another son they named Henry 2 years after that. The house that had seemed spacious when they first moved in became cozy and cramped, and Zachary built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the main room. Thomas remained a constant presence in their lives. He eventually retired from his position as postmaster, and Zachary took over the role, managing the post office with the same dedication that Thomas had shown. Harper split her time between helping at the post office and caring for the children, and though the days were long and often exhausting, she would not have traded them for anything. The children grew. William was serious and thoughtful, with a love of books that reminded Harper of her own mother. Rose was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and catching frogs and begging her father to teach her to ride. Henry was sweet and gentle, happiest when he was helping his mother in the garden or playing quietly with his wooden toys. Zachary proved to be everything Harper had hoped he would be as a husband and father. He was patient and kind, firm when he needed to be, but never harsh. He taught the children to ride and shoot, to respect the land and the animals, to value honesty and hard work. He told them stories about the old days, about riding for the Pony Express and working cattle drives, about the time he won their grandmother's horse in a card game. And always, he loved Harper with a devotion that never wavered. Even after years of marriage, even after the routines of daily life had worn away the initial excitement of new love, he would still look at her sometimes with an expression that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. "What are you thinking?" Harper would ask on those occasions. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Zachary would reply, and then he would pull her close and kiss her, and Harper would feel 18 again, standing in the hallway of the post office with her hand on his arm, recognizing in him something she had been searching for without even knowing it. The town of Montrose grew and changed around them. The railroad came through in 1890, bringing with it new settlers and new businesses. The population swelled, and what had once been a small frontier town became a bustling community. But through all the changes, the post office remained a constant, and Zachary and Harper remained fixtures of the town, respected and loved by their neighbors. Thomas lived to see his 70th birthday, surrounded by his nieces and nephews and the great-nieces and great-nephews who had started to arrive as William and Rose came of age. He passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, and the whole town turned out for his funeral. Zachary delivered the eulogy, his voice steady as he spoke about the man who had given him a chance, who had welcomed him into his family, who had become more than a brother-in-law, but a true friend. Harper grieved deeply for Thomas, but she took comfort in knowing that he had lived a long and happy life, that he had been surrounded by love until the very end. The children, as children do, grew up and made their own lives. William became a lawyer, studying at a university in Denver and returning to Montrose to open a practice. He married a school teacher named Alice, and they gave Harper and Zachary their first grandchildren, twin boys who were as mischievous as they were charming. Rose, true to her wild nature, married a rancher and moved to Wyoming, where she raised horses and cattle and 5 daughters who were every bit as adventurous as their mother. She visited Montrose twice a year, and her arrivals were always cause for celebration. Henry, the gentlest of the 3, became a teacher. He never married, but he was beloved by his students and devoted to his parents, often stopping by the house for supper and staying late into the evening to talk with Zachary about politics or philosophy or the latest book he had read. As Harper and Zachary aged, they slowed down. Zachary eventually retired from the post office, handing over the management to William, who hired his own staff to handle the daily operations. Harper spent her days in the garden, tending the flowers and vegetables that she had always loved, and in the evenings, she and Zachary would sit on the front porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands like the young couple they had once been. "You remember the day we met?" Harper asked one evening when they were both well into their 60s. "I remember everything about that day," Zachary said. "I remember walking into the post office and seeing you standing there and thinking that you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I remember the way you looked at me, like you were trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted. I remember the way your hand felt when you touched my arm." Harper smiled. "I remember thinking that you looked like trouble." Zachary laughed. "I was trouble. I am still trouble." "You are my trouble," Harper said, squeezing his hand, "and I would not have it any other way." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out, the same stars they had watched on their wedding night, on the night William was born, on 1,000 other nights over the course of their long marriage. "You delivered yourself to me," Harper said softly, repeating the words that had become a kind of talisman for them, a reminder of how they had begun. "And you gave me a home," Zachary replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me everything." Harper leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that until the moon rose, bathing the mountains in silver light. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was rich and full and endlessly, achingly beautiful. Years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new sorrows. They lost friends to illness and age, saw the town continue to grow and modernize, watched as the 20th century arrived, and with it automobiles and telephones, and all manner of wonders they had never imagined when they were young. But through it all, Harper and Zachary remained constant. They had their health for longer than most, a blessing they attributed to clean living and mountain air, and the simple fact that they had each other. On their 40th wedding anniversary, William organized a celebration at the town hall, and it seemed like half of Montrose turned out to honor the couple who had become something of a legend in the community. People told stories about the day Zachary had fought Cutler Briggs, about Harper's kindness and generosity, about the family they had raised and the lives they had touched. Harper was embarrassed by all the attention, but Zachary basked in it, telling his own stories and making everyone laugh with his recollections of early days in Montrose. "Speech, speech." Someone called, and the crowd took up the chant. Zachary stood, still tall and straight despite his years, and raised a hand for silence. "When I rode into Montrose 42 years ago," he began, "I was a man with nothing. No home, no family, no prospects. I was carrying a dead man's mail because it seemed like the right thing to do, but I had no idea where I was going or what I would find when I got there." He paused, his eyes finding Harper in the crowd. "And then I walked into the post office and I saw her, and in that moment, everything changed. Harper gave me a reason to stay, a reason to build instead of run, a reason to believe that I could be more than just a drifter. She gave me a home and a family and a life that has been richer and fuller than anything I could have imagined." His voice broke, and he cleared his throat. "They say that a man is lucky if he finds one great love in his lifetime. I found mine 42 years ago, and I have loved her more with every passing day. So here is to Harper, my wife, my partner, my best friend. You delivered yourself to me, and I have been grateful every moment since." The crowd erupted in applause, and Harper made her way through the people to stand beside Zachary. He wrapped his arm around her and she leaned into him, tears streaming down her face. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Zachary replied. "Always." In their 80s, when most of their contemporaries had passed on and their own health was beginning to fail, Harper and Zachary made a decision. They had lived long, full lives. They had seen their children grow and thrive. They had held grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They had built something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. "I am ready," Zachary said to Harper one morning as they sat in their bedroom, the morning light streaming through the window. "Whenever it is time, I am ready." "Me too," Harper said, taking his hand. "But not yet. We still have a little more time." And they did. They had another year, a precious gift of time in which they said their goodbyes, told their stories one more time, made sure that their children and grandchildren knew how much they were loved. Zachary went first, peacefully in his sleep on a cold January morning. Harper found him when she woke, his hand still clasped in hers, his face serene. She did not cry immediately. Instead, she sat with him for a long while, stroking his hair and remembering all the years they had shared, all the moments that had made up their life together. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by what seemed like the entire town. Zachary was buried in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Montrose, with a view of the mountains he had loved. Harper stood by the grave, supported by her children, and she did not weep. She knew that Zachary would not have wanted her to mourn. He would have wanted her to remember the joy. After Zachary's death, Harper continued to live in their house for a few more months. But it was too quiet without him, too empty, and eventually she agreed to move in with William and Alice. She spent her days reading and gardening and telling stories to her great-grandchildren, who would sit at her feet and listen with wide eyes as she recounted tales of the Wild West, of cowboys and outlaws, of a postmaster's sister who fell in love with a man who delivered letters. Harper lived for another year after Zachary's passing. In that time, she wrote down their story, filling page after page with her memories, wanting to make sure that future generations would know how it had all begun, how a chance meeting had turned into a lifetime of love. On a warm spring morning, as the flowers she had planted so many years ago were beginning to bloom, Harper closed her eyes for the last time. She died as peacefully as Zachary had, with a smile on her face and his name on her lips. They buried her beside Zachary, and on the headstone, William had inscribed the words that had defined their relationship. "You delivered yourself to me, and I have been grateful every moment since." The house that Harper and Zachary had built remained in the family for generations. William inherited it, and then his children, and then their children. It was maintained and cherished, a tangible link to the past, to the story of two people who had found each other in the Wild West and built a love that transcended time. In the town of Montrose, the story of Harper and Zachary became legend. Parents would tell it to their children, who would tell it to their own children in turn. The post office, which still stood on the same spot where it had been when Zachary first walked through the door, became a kind of shrine. Tourists would stop to take pictures, and locals would point out the window where Harper had first seen Zachary dismounting from his horse. And on the hill overlooking the town, two graves sat side by side, the headstones weathered by time but still readable. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting and the mountains glowed with golden light, people swore they could see two figures standing together by the graves, holding hands and looking out over the valley. It was said that true love never dies, that it echoes through the ages, touching the lives of those who come after. And in Montrose, Colorado, in the house on the hill and the post office on the main street and the cemetery where two lovers rested side by side, the love of Harper and Zachary lived on, a testament to the power of connection, the beauty of commitment, and the enduring truth that sometimes, when you least expect it, someone delivers themselves to you, and your whole life changes. The legacy they left behind was more than just stories and buildings. It was in the values they had instilled in their children, the kindness they had shown to their neighbors, the example they had set of what it meant to love someone wholly and completely. Through good times and bad, through youth and age, through all the challenges and triumphs that life brings. William, following in his parents' footsteps, became a pillar of the community. He practiced law with integrity and compassion, never forgetting the lessons his father had taught him about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. He and Alice raised their children with the same love and dedication that they had received, and the Dalton name became synonymous with honor and decency in Montrose. Rose, wild and free as she had always been, nevertheless carried her parents' love with her to Wyoming. She taught her daughters to be strong and independent, to value love and loyalty, to never settle for less than they deserved. She told them the story of how their grandparents met, how a cowboy delivering letters had found the woman who would become his whole world. Henry, in his quiet way, perhaps embodied his parents' legacy most completely. He dedicated his life to education, believing as his grandmother had that knowledge was the key to a better future. He never married, but he loved deeply in his own way, forming lasting friendships and touching countless lives through his teaching. When he died at the age of 75, his funeral was attended by hundreds of former students, all of whom had stories about how Mr. Dalton had changed their lives. As the 20th century progressed and Montrose continued to grow, the story of Harper and Zachary became a part of the town's identity. The Historical Society preserved letters that Harper had written, photographs of the family, even the original ledgers from the post office that showed Zachary's careful handwriting recording mail deliveries from the 1880s and 1890s. On the centennial of their wedding, the town held a celebration. Descendants of Harper and Zachary came from across the country, dozens of people who carried their blood and their legacy. They gathered at the cemetery to lay flowers on the graves, then proceeded to the old house, where a historical marker was unveiled, commemorating the site as the home of two of Montrose's most beloved citizens. Among the descendants was a young woman named Harper Rose Dalton, the great-great-granddaughter of the original Harper. She bore a striking resemblance to her ancestor, with the same dark hair and warm eyes. Standing at the grave, she read aloud from the memoir that Harper had written in the last year of her life, her voice clear and steady as she recounted the story of that first meeting, of a cowboy walking into a post office and a woman who knew immediately that her life was about to change. "He delivered himself to me," Harper Rose read, "and in doing so, he delivered me to myself. He showed me what it meant to be brave, to choose love over fear, to build instead of run. He gave me everything I ever wanted and so much more that I never knew I needed. And when I stood beside him, when I took his hand and promised to love him for as long as we both should live, I knew that I was making the easiest promise I would ever make. Because loving Zachary was as natural as breathing, as necessary as air. He was my home, my heart, my everything. And though our time together eventually ended, the love we shared never will. It will echo through the generations, a reminder that the best things in life are worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a whole life around." There was not a dry eye in the crowd when Harper Rose finished reading. The descendants stood together, united by blood and by the story of two people who had loved each other so completely that their love had become immortal. As the years continued to pass, as the 21st century dawned and Montrose entered a new era, the story of Harper and Zachary remained constant. It was taught in schools as part of local history. It was featured in books about the American West. It inspired artists and poets and musicians who sought to capture something of that pure, transformative love. But more than that, it continued to inspire ordinary people, couples who visited Montrose and stopped at the cemetery to see the graves, who stood hand in hand and made silent promises to love each other as completely as Harper and Zachary had. Young people who were just beginning their own love stories would seek out the historical marker at the house, taking pictures and dreaming of building something equally lasting. Older couples, celebrating decades of marriage, would retrace the steps that Harper and Zachary had taken, walking through Montrose and remembering their own first meetings, their own promises, their own journey through life together. The post office, modernized and expanded but still occupying the same spot, became a place of pilgrimage. People would mail letters from there specifically so they could say they had sent correspondence from the place where one of the great love stories of the American West had begun. The current postmaster, a distant cousin of the Dalton family, kept a photograph of Harper and Zachary on the wall behind the counter, and he never tired of telling their story to curious visitors. And in the house on the hill, which remained occupied by Dalton descendants, there was a room that had been preserved exactly as it had been when Harper and Zachary lived there. The bed where they had slept, the rocking chair where Harper had nursed her babies, the desk where Zachary had kept his accounts, all were maintained as a kind of shrine to their memory. Family members would sometimes spend the night in that room, and they always reported the same thing: a sense of peace, of being surrounded by love, of knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves. The story of Harper and Zachary was not just a story of romantic love, though it was certainly that. It was a story of courage, of two people who had both lost everything and found the strength to build something new. It was a story of commitment, of choosing to stay even when leaving would have been easier. It was a story of partnership, of two people who complemented each other, who brought out the best in each other, who faced life's challenges together rather than alone. It was a story of the American West in all its complexity, the beauty and the danger, the promise and the hardship, the way that people from different backgrounds and different circumstances could come together and create something meaningful. Zachary, the drifter who had lost his family's ranch and spent years moving from place to place, and Harper, the city girl who had come west after losing her parents, had found in each other exactly what they needed. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story that reminded people that love, true love, was worth everything. Worth the risk, worth the vulnerability, worth the work required to maintain it year after year. In a world that often seemed cynical and jaded, the story of Harper and Zachary offered hope, a reminder that genuine connection was possible, that happy endings were real, that two people could find each other against all odds and build a life that mattered. As the decades rolled on and the 21st century progressed, Montrose continued to change and grow. New buildings went up, old ones came down. Technology transformed the way people lived and worked and communicated. But through all the changes, the story remained, passed down from generation to generation, a constant in an ever-changing world. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting behind the mountains and the air was still and clear, if you stood in just the right spot at the cemetery on the hill, you could almost hear it. The sound of laughter, the murmur of quiet conversation, the rustle of a woman's skirts as she walked beside the man she loved. You could almost see them, Harper and Zachary, young again and whole, standing together and looking out over the valley that had been their home, their hands clasped, their faces turned toward each other with expressions of perfect contentment. Because some loves are so powerful, so complete, that they transcend death itself. Some loves echo through eternity, touching the lives of people they will never meet, inspiring hope and faith and the courage to believe that somewhere out there is someone waiting, someone who will deliver themselves to you just as you deliver yourself to them. And together you will build something beautiful, something lasting, something that will endure long after you are gone. That was the legacy of Harper and Zachary Dalton. Not just a story, but a promise. A promise that love was real, that it was worth seeking, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. A promise that happy endings existed, that two people could find each other and create something extraordinary together. A promise that no matter how lost you might feel, no matter how alone, somewhere out there was a person who would see you, truly see you, and in seeing you would change everything. And so their story lived on, told and retold, cherished and preserved, a gift from the past to the future, a reminder of what was possible when two hearts recognized each other and refused to let go. In the town of Montrose, Colorado, in the shadow of the San Juan Mountains, the love of a postmaster's sister and a cowboy who delivered letters remained as vibrant and alive as it had been on that August day in 1883, when their eyes first met, and they both knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that they had found what they had been searching for all along. Each other, home forever,